Hello everybody, Idre here, and today I'm going to be doing another installment of my Great Classic Albums series. This is my second episode in this series. Now, I'm not going to go out of my way and say every single one of these albums are 10 out of 10, but what I am going to say is that all these albums, in my opinion, are great classic albums that have not only had an impact on me, but are important for the artist and the audience as a whole. Now, you see, this is a very broad term. I don't really have any specific start and end dates for what makes something classic. In many ways, considering I started this channel in 2020, anything before 2020 in my mind, if I think it has had a big enough impact and I think it is good enough, it could fall into this video. So that means anything from the year 0 to like 2019. But either way, these are 10 albums that I'm going to dive into that I think are some of the best albums out there. Let's go wind the clock back to, I believe, 1959 with Santo and Johnny's self-titled album. Now, Santo and Johnny, to me, is a really good duo that is often overlooked. A lot of 50s artists, are well-liked, well-praised, and are given the respect they need. Elvis, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, Little Richard. The list is endless. But one artist that I often see pushed aside simply because they are in some ways a one-hit wonder is Santo and Johnny. They are very instrumental. They have and they are centered around the slide guitar. And while this self-titled album from 1959 includes Sleepwalk, the whole album in general is a really solid, put-together piece of nice little, beachy, surfy slide guitar music that's very reminiscent or very telling of its time. And I just think it's some great musicianship, some beautiful slide guitar playing, and I just wish more people gave Santo and Johnny the time of day. We're going to move quite ahead a little bit for the second album I will be covering, and the second album is Black Sabbath Masters of Reality from 1971. Now, this really is the album in which Black Sabbath definitely grabs my attention. Now, that's not to put aside Paranoid and their self-titled album, because those are great classic albums in their own right, but there is something about the overall sound and style they went with, which is just so much more heavier, so much more muddy and gritty, and to the point on Masters of Reality. Perhaps the thing that may make this album even better is the fact that it is a relatively short album, not much longer than 30-something minutes, and yet it packs such a hard, heavy-hitting punch, and the sludgy guitars, it's almost like pre-doom metal in many ways. The song Children of the Grave, in my opinion, is their greatest song with the little intro of Embryo, and I actually think some of the more slower acoustic and thought-out songs like that, Embryo, Orchid, they all work really well and have some great guitar work. But really, everybody's on top of their game here. Really solid album, front to finish. Definitely my favorite Black Sabbath release. And definitely one of the best metal albums out there. The third album I'm going to be covering in this video is the self-titled Killing Joke album from 1980. Killing Joke, to me, is a band that is well appreciated amongst music circles, but in a grand scheme of things, they are often pushed aside, and a lot of other bands from this era do get a bit more attention. And while I am not completely opposed to that, I do think that, bands like the Sex Pistols, Ramones, The Clash, etc. are extremely important. But, that being said, this Killing Joke album, in my opinion, is one of the most well-aged post-punk albums out there, with some solid production, great guitar tone, and I love the elements of experimental electronic and synthesizers throughout. Overall, it does remind me a little bit of the early Cure material on Free Imaginary Boys, and even a little bit of Bauhaus on some songs. But there is something very unique about Killing Joke, and I think that it's an album that everybody should check out. It's a very gritty, very well produced, and very influential album. A lot of great bands have cited it as a big influence. So yes, Killing Joke's self-titled album definitely deserves a place on this list. Also from 1980, I'm going to be covering my fourth album, Judas Priest, British Steel. Well, Black Sabbath may be the founders, not or like one of the biggest influencers in early metal. One of my favorite bands that come out of the late 70s and early 80s in the metal scene is Judas Priest, without a doubt. Not only is Rob Halford's vocals some of the best in the game, the track list on British Steel is so solid. And not only does it contain hits like Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight, songs like Grinder, and songs like Metal Gods, they're all so good. And to me, probably my favorite Judas Priest album. Some of the best, and there's a lot of good variety on this album as well. There's some songs that even have some reggae in there. But for the most part, I think British Steel, one of the best metal albums to come out of 1980 and the 80s as a whole. And Judas Priest does get a lot of appreciation, but this album specifically is definitely, in my opinion, their best. The fifth album I will be covering is from The Police, Ghost in the Machine. The Police are a really interesting band, a really talented band, and a really well-liked and appreciated band as well. But with that being said, I still think they deserve a spot on this list, and I still think I should take the time to talk about Ghost in the Machine, an extremely solid album. And I think, they've always had that sort of post-punk, very unique sound to them. This album, Ghost in the Machine, really does, I think, really solidify their style and their sound. Not only is each of the members on top of their game here, their sound there is definitely a bit more laid-back energy. It's a lot more calm in many spots as well. But there is still that reggae influence, which is actually pretty strong on a lot of these tracks. Like One World is a great example of that. And in many ways, I think those songs really do show off Sting's bass playing quite a bit. And I think overall, the album itself is just a really solid piece of work that might be my favorite Police album out there. So definitely everybody check out The Police, Ghost in the Machine. The sixth album I am going to be talking about is New Order, Power, Corruption, and Lies. New Order, I've always had a slight bias over them compared to Joy Division. I've always kind of preferred the more synth pop sound. And I don't think there's any album that nearly represents that as well as Power, Corruption, and Lies. And while it doesn't include the big hits like, Blue Monday or Bizarre Love Triangle, overall, it's a really solid album. And it's a good blend of the synth pop and the more post-punk sound that they have explored with their entire career. And what I love about it is the fact that they're kind of able to seamlessly blend the two together without it coming across as awkward or weird or like lopsided. And if you know what I'm saying. Overall, New Order to me is one of the best new wave bands out there, one of the best synth pop bands out there, and Power, Corruption, and Lies is definitely their magnum opus. The seventh album I'll be covering, where I'm moving into the 90s, is from, no doubt, Tragic Kingdom. And what a great album. It's definitely an album that I've always just known about, always liked, but it wasn't until recently that I really dived deep into it and started appreciating it the most. Not only do I just appreciate Gwen Stefani's vocals because they are so raw, and it's funny because she's not technically the greatest singer in the world, but her delivery on this project is just really, really, really great. And I like how they do blend that whole ska punk sound into a more pop-friendly package compared to the likes of Rancid and Operation Ivy, which I like arguably more than New Order, or than No Doubt. But I do think that No Doubt really did perfectly craft their sound for this album. And Spiderweb's great song, Just a Girl, great song. Overall, great album that is very much of its time, but I do think deserves all the credit. And I just think it's a solid album. I think No Doubt should be taken a bit more seriously. The eighth album I will be covering is from Modest Mouse. The This Is a Long Drive album, their debut album. Definitely a great indie, just raw, to the point album. Funny enough, there's a lot of references to Santo and Johnny, like I previously mentioned in this video. But yeah, Modest Mouse is they're good. They're very indie. They're very raw. The production on this album is very poor from a very technical standpoint, but that's what really gives this album that extra charm. They're very raw, gritty, and just production is definitely gives this album a vibe. The drumming is very unique for Modest Mouse as a whole, especially on this album. And the little clean guitar licks and the twanginess of it really does make this album, to me, stand out against all their other works. And I just love this album. I think it's very raw, very just like aggressive, very rural sounding. Yeah, Modest Mouse is a long drive, great album. The ninth album I will be covering in this video is from Phantom Planet, The Guest. I recently covered their album Devastator in the latest albums I missed video. And I briefly mentioned that even though I liked the album, I didn't think it was as good as The Guest. The Guest is from, I believe, 2002, and it does contain the big hit California, which was the theme of the OC, one of my favorite TV shows. And while I might be a little biased, the whole album itself, to me, is a really great indie album. And it's just full, jam-packed with excellent songs that I think are massively overlooked due to the popularity of California. Phantom Planet is often kind of just pushed aside, not thought of that much looking back at the 2000s decade. But I could pretty safely say they are one of the top indie bands from that era. And this album, The Guest, really does show that it has that very California beach bum type sound, while still being a completely solid album. I love it. Nothing else to say. And the final and 10th album I will be covering is also the most recent album on this list. It's from C418, and it is Dief. Dief from, I believe, 2017, so it's not even that old. And I wouldn't say it's even the most influential album ever because, quite frankly, a lot of people don't even know it exists. But I would argue, with the exception of Minecraft Volume Alpha, which I did make a video of a while back, I think Dief is definitely his most thorough, to the point, and well-executed work. It is very ambient, but he doesn't stray away from using more lo-fi style beats. And I can just say right now that it's definitely one of the projects I come back to the most, because it is so short compared to his other works. You know, you go into it kind of being skeptical because usually his works are hours long, but this one's very 30-something minutes. It's to the point. Every track is great. I think it's C418 at his peak. Now, that's a good sign, considering Excursions, which came after, is also really good as well, so I do hope that he continues to put out great music. But I do think it was a very stylistic, good point for him to be at, musically, because he kind of showed to the world that, he can make a shorter, more eccentric album and still translate it well. So I appreciated that, and that is it for now. Hope you guys enjoyed these 10 albums that I talked about. If you haven't heard them, check them out. They're really good. I'll put the list of albums I talked about in the description below, and I will hopefully do a new review soon. That is it for now, and goodbye.